At the end of July 1942, Cororo Island was a South Pacific tropical paradise, as I'm told it still is today. Back then, I was CPL, or J. Marion, a squad leader in the 1st Platoon of L Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, or L-3-5, and we were about to invade the Fiji island of Cororo. We were not going into combat, but engaging in practice amphibious landings, making a brief stop on our way from Wellington, New Zealand, to a real invasion at a place that turned out to be Guadalcanal. We didn't know it yet, but we were just over a week away from fighting one of the pivotal campaigns of World War II. We arrived in the Fiji Islands aboard the transport ship USS Fuller, and on the morning of July 28th, we climbed down the Fuller's cargo nets and boarded the Higgins boats that were about to storm peaceful Cororo Island. The 1st Platoon's Higgins boat was approximately at the centre of the first wave, and my position as portside Lewis gunner in the bow gave me a fine view in all directions. That was an advantage the rest of the platoon didn't enjoy. Their orders were to keep their heads below the gunwale, a perfect place for anybody who enjoys inhaling the landing craft's diesel fumes. That day and the next few gave us unnecessary practice in large-scale Higgins boat movements. We spent July 28th to 31 aimlessly riding up to Cororo's reef and back to the ship. Cororo is one of the smallest of the Fiji Islands. I'd estimate it to be no more than 8 or 9 miles from one end to the other, and less than 3 miles wide. I'm guessing here because L Company saw only a very small part of it. Today's maps show a couple of tiny villages located a safe distance away from where our manoeuvres took place. But back then, and from our point of view, the main thing Cororo Island did have was beaches barricaded by coral reefs. A junior naval officer was assigned to our boat for the landings. Rumour had it that he held the title of Wave Commander, and as he directed the first wave toward Cororo Island, those of us who were able to see the beach knew we had a problem on our hands. Even a dummy like me, without any training, could see that given our heading and the movement of the water, we wouldn't even come close to our designated landing point. Back in 42, a Marine officer or staff NCO was considered unqualified to direct any phase of any kind of amphibious operation until it was well ashore. The US Navy was supposed to do the directing. I've often wondered how we survived going ashore without the Navy's special assistance. Our first wave approached the beach about 1 mile to the right of the designated landing point. The beach was littered with coral and lava rock, which forced the landing craft to stop about 50 yards from the beach's waterline. Had this been the real thing, with enemy gun emplacements on the beach, we'd all have been killed for sure. The platoon went over the side and into the water. Then we stumbled, fell, and tripped in surf and coral. Somehow we made it to the beach. I vividly remember arriving on that beach because there at the berm line was a small grove of lemon trees. I picked a couple of the lemons and ate them like oranges, much to the annoyance of salivating troopers nearby. For most people, lemons are too sour to eat that way, but to this day I find them great thirst quenchers, especially after strenuous exercise. And anybody who has ever stumbled through 50 yards of surf on slippery coral and lava will tell you that they've just experienced a bout of strenuous exercise. We hiked along the shoreline until we reached the place where we should have landed. From there, we boarded our Higgins boats and returned to our ships. On the second day, we went ashore again, and this time we were dropped to the left of the designated landing point. Positioned behind us, a short distance out at sea, 2 of our destroyers gave us live covering fire from what I estimated to be 3-inch or 5-inch guns. The trouble is, one of the destroyers didn't get the word to cease fire when we got to the beach. We had to hug the sand at the waterline and pray a little. The Higgins boats backed off, and it took a lot of semaphoring from several coxswains to convince the destroyer that the moment had arrived for them to cease fire. Somehow we made it back to our transport ship, and we chalked up the incident as just another day's work. The following day, we made our final practice landing, and thanks to the Navy, that turned out to be the biggest screw-up of them all. Like many other experienced Marines, my 20-year active career included several adventures that made me doubt the IQs of the top brass in the US Navy. That final Cororo Island landing was one of them. After the Guadalcanal invasion, the newspaper headlines might have read, "Everyone went to the amphibious landing, but the first wave missed the boat." That's damn near what happened. We almost missed the Guadalcanal landing because barely 1 week before D-Day, we found ourselves stranded on Cororo Island. That could have spelled disaster for the Guadalcanal campaign. On our final Cororo Island landing, we went ashore at almost the correct spot, but after that, everything went wrong. As we reboarded our landing craft and began heading back to sea to be picked up by our transports, we suddenly faced deep trouble. The entire fleet was taking off at full speed, and our view of the US Navy was smoke and ships' sterns disappearing on the horizon. Then all that was left were smokestacks. Those guys are taking off on us, I thought. We didn't know what was happening, but we knew it wasn't part of our landing operation. We looked at each other thinking, what the hell's up? It was late afternoon, getting near dusk. Our Higgins boats were in a V formation, chasing the fleet and not catching up. My platoon's boat led the hapless formation, and one of our sailors started signalling a destroyer by semaphore. "What's going on?" No response. It was getting near dark, and we were being abandoned in the wrong part of that unimaginably huge body of water called the Pacific Ocean. Worse yet, though we didn't know it, we were the Marines scheduled to be the first wave to land on Guadalcanal, the ones slated to make the first offensive landing against the Japanese in World War II. Frantic, our sailor signalled again, asking for information and advice. We were a long way from shore by now, and the only vessel in sight was the rearguard destroyer, now about a mile ahead of us. Finally, a sailor appeared on the destroyer's fantail and started signalling. It was getting harder to see, but we were able to make out his flags. His message told us to return to the beach. He kept signalling, breaking worse news yet. Japanese fleet in the vicinity. "Holy Christ!" we said to each other. "We're stranded in the middle of the ocean. It's damn near dark. Cororo Island is behind us, over the horizon and out of sight, and the damn Japanese Navy is coming after us." Our Higgins boat's sailor signalled the destroyer. "How do we get back to the beach? Give us an azimuth." We waited a painfully long time, and after what seemed like a week, we got an answer consisting of an azimuth, the approximate number of miles back to the beach, and good luck. Yeah, good luck. Daylight gave out completely as we received that final message. The destroyer vanished into the night. This was our first experience of abandonment by our own navy. We didn't know it then, but it wouldn't be our last. At a signal from our boat, the other Higgins boats moved in close with engines idling. The situation was explained from boat to boat, and the destroyer's directions were passed from coxswain to coxswain. The boats formed a single file, each close to the boat ahead of it, with our boat in the lead. It was a moonless night, and by now it was dark as hell. We went on for what seemed like hours, not daring to use our running lights, not with the Japanese Navy lurking somewhere out there. Every once in a while the boats would stop and the crews would check to be sure the formation hadn't lost any of the craft. We travelled strictly by compass. Thank Christ that the sailors manning the Higgins boats knew their business. As it turns out, these operators were Coast Guardsmen. Our column of boats travelled for about an hour in total darkness. Then word was passed, engines were cut off, and everyone fell silent. We listened for the sound of surf. There was none. For all we could tell, Cororo Island had just sunk to the bottom of the Pacific. We started up again, and it might have been a half-hour later when one of the guys called out. Again the engines were cut, and we all held our breath and listened. There it was, the sound of surf. Maybe we were going to survive this disaster after all. One of the Higgins boats found a passage through the reef and made it to the beach. The rest of us followed. We disembarked, then helped beach the boats before we prepared to settle down for the night. L Company of the first wave of Marines had just made it back to Cororo Island. We were a hell of a long way from Guadalcanal, but the Japanese Navy hadn't gotten us, and we were still in one piece. We were merely abandoned by our own Navy. We didn't have our field packs with us, because we hadn't planned to spend any more time on this beach than it would take to land and then go back to the Fuller. No packs meant no supplies, but we made the best of the situation. We built small fires on the beach to keep warm, and that's how we spent the night. With morning, some of the men explored the area and returned with arms full of yams, fruit, a few chickens, and a couple of small pigs. Breakfast was beckoning. Best damn chow we'd had since leaving Wellington, New Zealand. We waited on the beach, we waited some more. By now it was the middle of the afternoon, and we were still waiting. Then, far off on the horizon, the tiny images of ships started to appear. The US Navy was returning. We responded by backing the Higgins boats off the beach, and soon we were aboard them, heading out toward the fleet. We eventually caught up with the Fuller, but even while L Company was climbing the transport's cargo net, the fleet continued moving. We hadn't been worth stopping for, but at least the Navy decided to give us a break and slow down. Back aboard our ship, nobody from the Navy bothered to tell the Marines why they'd bugged off on us. At the time, it didn't bother us as much as it should have. Most of us were young, still kids, and we didn't always know enough to realize when we were being slighted. We were just the dumb troops who were going to land on Guadalcanal and help change the course of World War II in the Pacific. Not long after we made the real landing, the D-Day landing on the canal, we would become expendable again. And then we'd drop down one more notch. This group of young, expendable Marines would once again be abandoned. The Cororo Island incident has an ironic postscript. Years later, when talking about it with sailor friends, several of them corrected my story. One of them was my brother Jim, who was a sailor aboard the battleship North Carolina. "That was no Japanese task force approaching our fleet," one of them told me, and the others agreed. They insisted it was the US battleship North Carolina and her battle group moving in to join us for the landing operation. This isn't official. It's only what I heard from a couple of the US Navy's ordinary seamen. Even so, I'm inclined to take their word for it. While we went through our comedy of errors on Cororo Island, my parents, relatives and friends back in Buffalo didn't have any idea where I was, only that I was with my Marine unit somewhere in the South Pacific. When they picked up their copy of the Buffalo Evening News on July 27th, they read, "Back on Cororo Island and aboard the Fuller, we didn't know anything about New Guinea. At the time, I'm not sure I knew where New Guinea was located or that it even existed. We were too busy getting ready for our own coming battle." After the naval screw-up that nearly left L Company and our Higgins boats abandoned in the Fiji Islands, the 4 days that followed on the USS Fuller were uneventful. On D-Day -1, we were briefed on our destination, an island in the Solomon chain called Guadalcanal, and were told what little was known about it. Details came mainly from civilians who had operated coconut palm plantations along the coast before evacuating when the Solomons turned into a war zone. Our officers had maps, but we later found out that the maps were inaccurate in many details. We were told that the Japanese had an engineering party and construction crew on the island and were building an airfield. That much was correct. Our mission was to take that field away from them. The Japanese had a military unit supporting the construction crew, but we were told that its strength was unknown. It turned out that our operations planner overestimated Japanese military strength on the canal at the beginning of August, but in any case, we were given to understand that we wouldn't have much cause for worry when we landed. Famous last words. I have a vivid recollection of something that happened on the evening of August 6th. My unit, aboard the USS Fuller, was approaching Guadalcanal, and we knew that when morning came, we were going to make our landing. Having gotten all my gear and equipment ready for the next day, I was lying in my canvas bunk in close quarters below deck, reading whatever I was able to get my hands on that day, when a good buddy, Francis R. Chink McCallan, came over to talk with me. I could tell he was upset about something and wanted to get it off his chest. I put down my book, and he started telling me what was bothering him. A little earlier that evening, right after chow, Chink's closest friend, Sergeant William Steen, had quietly cornered him and handed him a sealed envelope. "What's this?" McCallan had asked. "It's a letter," Steen said, "to my wife." Both Steen and McCallan were from Portland, Maine. Steen had gotten special leave just before we'd left stateside, and had married a hometown girl. Now Steen was giving Chink the letter he'd just written to her. "I've got a strange feeling," Steen told him. "I don't think I'm going to make it through the Guadalcanal operation." At first, Chink tried to scoff, but seeing that Steen was serious, he grew distressed. "Look, Chink," Steen said, "if anybody's going to make it through this war, you will. After the Guadalcanal operation, please mail this letter to my wife." Now Chink was telling me Steen's story. "Why me?" Chink asked. "Why did he choose me to take this responsibility?" "What's the big deal, Chink?" I said. "Just stuff the envelope in your field pack, and when the operation's over, you can give it back to him. By then you can both laugh about it." But Chink was really distraught. We had reveille before dawn the morning of August 7th, our fleet now anchored in waters between Guadalcanal and Tulagi. The Navy gave us a good breakfast. That means there was a piece of meat with it. They'd feed you some good chow and push you off the ship, feeling like they did their duty. Soon after chow, we mustered on deck at our assigned stations. The sun was up by now, and the morning sky was clear, the weather calm. We heard distant booms as our cruisers began shelling the beach. Several of our planes came overhead, I'm guessing from a carrier located somewhere beyond our horizon. They flew directly over us on their way to the island, where they dropped bombs along the beach. At about that time, we were scrambling down our ship's cargo nets and into our Higgins boats. We were the first platoon of L Company, commanded by Captain Lyman D. Spurlock, in the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment. Our platoon leader was Lieutenant John Flash Flaherty, a Yale graduate from a wealthy and prominent family. He was also a fine Marine who got his commission as second lieutenant in the Corps the day he graduated from college. There were other good Marines like him, young men from prominent families who believed it was their solemn duty to serve their country whenever the need arose. Also assigned to our Higgins boat was Sergeant Wild Bill Kulchicki, a tough, likeable veteran of military skirmishes in several parts of the world before World War II, a typical specimen of the old breed. He had also survived more than a couple of saloon brawls and thought of himself as an educated man, having earned his PhD in beer. But when the chips were down, we trusted Kulchicki, and he deserved our trust. He'd told us several times, "You know me, men. I'm Wild Bill, and I done fought me a couple of wars. You pay attention and stay with me, and I'm going to get you back home to your mama." For most of us, he succeeded. Our Higgins boat fully loaded, its diesel engine changed pitch, and we began moving away from the Fuller. It was mid-morning, a little before 0900 hours, and the sea was calm, the air windless, the sky bright, visibility unlimited. I had a better view than most. As I had during the Cororo Island manoeuvres, I was up in one of the boat's 2 machine gun turrets, manning one of the Lewis guns. The other Lewis gun was manned by my good buddy Parfit, Harry Stinky Denham. Our Higgins boat circled slowly, waiting for the other boats that would form our invasion wave. L Company would be part of the first wave. When all the first wave boats were ready, our coxswains manoeuvred them into formation, and we began moving toward the beach several thousand yards ahead. As we got closer to shore, our cruisers ceased fire, and our destroyers, with their smaller, shorter-range guns, took their turn firing over our heads, shelling the shore. Once in a while there would be a short lull in the firing, and in the far distance to our rear we'd hear muffled booms from the invasion of Tulagi and Gavutu, which by now was well underway. At about 600 yards out, Stinky Denham and I, along with the Lewis gunners on the rest of the first wave boats, began spraying the beach with machine gun fire. By then, our destroyers had stopped firing. Our machine gun fire was indiscriminate since we had no special targets. The general idea was to soften up the beach in case of any enemy presence there. Most of the other men on the boat were crouched low, heads below the top of the gunwale. That was standard operating procedure. The Higgins boat's diesel engine throbbed steadily, pushing us toward our landing site, which was designated on our maps as Beach Red 1. Looking to starboard, then to port, I had a good view of the other boats in the first wave. More Higgins boats were behind us, enough of them to land nearly 11,000 Marines. There was no sign of activity on the island. By now I had a clear view of the strip of sand beach and a structure of some kind that stood on the beach, a large hut. Behind it, at the berm line, there was tropical foliage, palm trees, and what looked like thick jungle growth. If the enemy was back there, they'd be watching us approach and getting ready for us. But we kept getting closer, and nothing appeared to move on the beach. The island's silence was ominous. Were the Japanese waiting for us to hit the beach before they opened fire? I could make out a big sign on the seaward-facing side of the building on the beach. That outbuilding stood smack in the middle of our approach point, and the sign read, "Lever Brothers, Limited Lever Brothers," on the beach of a remote jungle island held by the enemy. It was like a joke without a punchline. What the hell were the Lever Brothers doing in the middle of our combat zone? We didn't take any chances. We were well within range and didn't know who or what might be inside the building, so I trained my gun on the hut, and several others did the same. As I fired, I moved my gun from left to right and back again to get a crossfire effect with the other gunners. We poured maybe 100 rounds into that shack, but didn't get a single round of return fire. Not from the shack, and not from anywhere else. At about 100 yards from the beach, we ceased firing. I quickly cleared the Lewis gun and dropped down from my gunner's position to the stern, where I slipped on my light pack and grabbed my Springfield .03 rifle. Just about then, the boat scraped bottom at the shoreline, and I heard Sergeant Kulchicki's voice. "Go!" We went over the side, and I was right behind our platoon sergeant, Sergeant Quentin Shoemate, practically on his heels. Rolling out of the boat on the opposite side, our platoon leader, Lieutenant John Flash Flaherty, was the first from our company on the beach, with Sergeant Wild Bill Kulchicki directly behind him. Surf was low, and the first wave of boats had all come ashore in a comparatively straight line. My squad was over the side, directly behind me, all of us now keeping our correct distance apart, the way we'd been trained. Again, exactly as we were trained, I stopped, and the rest of my squad spread out. We hit the deck, prepared to lay down a base of fire if the situation called for it. We'd been well trained, and we felt ready. Nothing came from the jungle brush just a few yards ahead. Nothing came from the Lever Brothers' hut, now bullet-riddled and looking as though it had probably been deserted before our arrival. Everything was quiet, which left us with a strange feeling. Where were the Japanese? By the time we got up on the dry sand, we figured there were no Japanese around because they'd be shooting at us. There were plenty of spots close enough that they could have picked a few of us off. At a time like this, all your senses wake up and are on full blast. You hear everything. You see everything. There's a rush that's hard to describe. You've been practicing this for 2 years. You're ready for anything, and now here you are. You just don't know what to expect. What you were taught to expect was Japanese, and there weren't any. But you don't relax. You never relax your guard. Immediately, we were up again, the way we'd practiced 1,000 times during training exercises. You run. You get off the beach as fast as you can, and you head for your first objective. We crossed the sand beach, which was about 25 yards deep at our landing point. My squad reassembled just past the berm line, where the edge of jungle foliage gave us some natural cover. We'd never checked inside the shack, and I don't think any of the other squads did either. But we were on the alert. An infantryman's first moments in a combat situation are like being born into a brand new life. You find yourself looking around, seeing, hearing and smelling things in a way you never have before. The self-preservation drive instantly sharpens all your senses and instincts, and the computer in your brain takes in the 1,000 details around you, storing them all away, so that if you survive, you'll remember these details many years later, just as I recall them now. Jungle air everywhere has a distinctive, slightly unsavory smell, a rank, rich odour that makes you think of decay. I'd first noticed it before the war, in 1940-41, when our unit was stationed in Guantanamo and went for manoeuvres to some of the Caribbean islands. Guadalcanal's air smelled much the same way, slightly rotten, as the island's heat, humidity, flies and maggots did their work on fallen coconuts, dead vegetation, shellfish washed ashore, and the land animals that die in the natural course of events. Later, as weeks progressed and we started killing enemy and being killed by them, that faint but pervasive odour of rottenness would grow into something strong and terrible. It would become a gut-wrenching stench. We would live with it day and night. But not yet. On this first day, the jungle's overripe aroma was there, but was slight enough to disregard. Once we were off the beach, we swung to our right, moving parallel with the coastline, and crossed a small, shallow river that barely got our boots wet. It was the ILU River, which we Marines later nicknamed Alligator Creek. 2 weeks later, 2 other Marine units, not ours, would win an important victory at this spot in the famous Battle of the Tanaru, in which the 1st and 2nd Battalions, 1st Marine Regiment, would annihilate a Japanese attack force led by Colonel Kiyoano Ichiki. On that night, August 21st, and from our own defence position, we would hear the distant, steady rattle of gunfire, but wouldn't know what was going on until the following morning, when it was over. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Our maps weren't very reliable. In fact, I never saw a map of Guadalcanal until long after I left the island, and I'm not even certain that our platoon leader, Lieutenant Flaherty, saw one. Guadalcanal has dozens of streams, creeks and rivers, all of them flowing in a roughly northerly direction from the interior highlands, then emptying into the ocean. Our company crossed the ILU and advanced through a large area overgrown with tall, thick grass called kanai. That's where we stayed for the rest of the day, and through that first night, keeping alert for opposition that didn't materialize. While we were digging in on shore, we saw several 2-engine Japanese bombers, codenamed Betty, appear over the water, low in the sky, then drop bombs on our ships in the bay. There was a lot of commotion with the noise of the aircraft, some anti-aircraft fire, small boats shitting and getting, guys shouting. Right in front of us, we could see one of our transport ships, the George Eliot, get hit. A bomb went directly down into its hold and caused heavy damage. We knew there would be mangled bodies down there, some of them dead. We were already getting pretty used to death. The bombers were answered by AA guns from several of our ships, and we saw 1 or 2 enemy planes knocked out of the sky, trailing black smoke and with pieces falling off them before they crashed into the water. The Elliot moved away, smoking and limping toward Tulagi, where it beached. The Japanese bombers made just a single pass over our ships, then disappeared, but they'd thrown a scare into the US Navy. It wasn't long before our fleet began easing away, and by the time dusk approached, our ships were gone. Supplies had been unloaded in haste and not very efficiently. From where we were dug in, we could see them piled in haphazard stacks along the beach. What we didn't know yet was that they were all the supplies we were going to get for a while. Fearing the threat of a major Japanese attack, our ships were moving out on us, still carrying half the supplies we needed badly. For a second time, we were being abandoned. Soon it would be nightfall. Our orders were to stay put for the time being and dig in. Sergeant Kulchicki was going from one man to the next, laying out the platoon's positions within our area of responsibility. As an old China hand who had joined the Corps just after the Nicaragua campaign in the late 1920s, Kulchicki knew how to handle a combat situation. Our own education had hardly begun, but we were smart enough to know it, and to know we'd better listen to him. He was kind of funny, though, working his way back and forth along the line like an old mother hen, pointing out somebody's small mistake at one foxhole, advising how to correct it, giving the next guy a quick word to the wise, then moving on. To use one of Kulchicki's own turns of phrase, he was like a one-armed trombone player with the crabs. "Dig in a little deeper there, Mac," he'd say. He'd squat down and look out at the area beyond the perimeter. Then he'd extend his arm and swing it in a short arc. "Your field of fire will be from there to there." He'd move on to the next man, and he'd have more things to say. When he was satisfied, he called all the squad leaders together, and that included me. "I want you to be 100% alert as soon as it gets dark. No smoking in the foxholes, no talking, and everybody maintain fire discipline, just the way you've been trained. We don't want anybody getting trigger happy. Wait for a command to open fire." Troops put into a combat zone who have yet to face battle, combined with an order to maintain fire discipline, is what you might call a contradiction in terms. I didn't know that yet, but I'd find out soon enough. We went back to our holes and waited. In the jungle tropics, darkness arrives with a silent crash. I'd seen it before in other parts of the world, but its suddenness still came as a shock. Within minutes, everything around us went from daylight to pitch blackness. I could not see my hand in front of my face, so we waited, for the Japanese or for morning, whichever came first. I was down in my hole, and nobody was talking now, no unnecessary movement. Like most of the others around me, I'd have loved a cigarette just about then, but the smoking lamp was out and wouldn't be on again until morning. My eyeballs were actually hurting from staring into total blackness. The jungle's night noises always start the moment daylight disappears. Lizards scuttled in the thick kanai grass. A bird screeched in the distance, making an almost human sound, like no bird you'll ever hear back in the States. A rat scurried down from its nest, high in a coconut palm, and started its nightly foraging on the ground. Crickets and other night insects chirped and buzzed. I crouched in the darkness of my spider hole, not daring to move, or even whisper to a buddy just a few yards away. I had my rifle at the ready, but my index finger rested safely on the outside edge of the trigger guard. Under these conditions, you don't want to keep your finger on the trigger. It's too easy to squeeze off an accidental round and give away your position. The nerve-wracking night sounds underlined the fear in us all that an enemy point man might be just a few yards outside our perimeter, with a squad of Japanese creeping up right behind him. That's when I started hearing a new sound, a sound that turned my blood cold. Somebody was out there. I was hearing steady, shuffling footsteps in the grass, and they were coming straight at me. We'd been taught, warned, advised, threatened, indoctrinated, you name it, to hold our fire until we were sure we had a target. But one of our guys crouched somewhere to my left, panicked, and cranked off a round. Somebody else fired another round. We were nervous and shook, and every one of us was sure that the step-pause-step sound in the tall grass was a point man for a squad of Japanese. Sergeant Kulchiki was the first among us to show common sense. He went up and down the line, whispering to each of us, "Hold your fire, calm down, there's nothing out there but land crabs." Discipline and training always take over in the Corps, and we stopped firing. The only sounds now were the natural ones that always come out from the jungle, and among those, the step-pause-step of Guadalcanal's land crabs. What is a land crab? It's about 5 inches across, one leg longer than the other, ending in a big claw that's strong enough to snap an 1/8-inch twig in two. They had an alarming habit of dropping into a marine's foxhole just to keep him company. They eat anything that doesn't move, and if you're a combat infantryman who's been killed in action, the crabs will pick out your best parts and eat them too. I still hate those things, but land crabs were only the first of that night's strange noises. Sergeant Kulchiki and Lieutenant Flaherty shared a foxhole just a few yards from my position, near enough that at one point I could hear the lieutenant whisper to Kulchiki, "Take a break. I'll stay on top of things for a while. You can crap out and get some rest." Kulchiki apparently agreed, because I didn't hear another word. The next 5 minutes or so produced only the normal symphony of jungle sounds. Then, suddenly, without preliminaries of any kind, there came a series of god-awful noises, guttural noises, huffing and groaning sounds, all of them damn near loud enough to be heard halfway to Mount Austin, several miles inland. I was startled. Everybody around me was startled. But it was only Kulchiki, sound asleep and snoring. The rasping noise was steady by now, like an old steam-powered bandsaw, with every other tooth broken, trying to cut through a pine knot. Then, suddenly, came choking, gagging, spitting, and abrupt vocal detonations that no words can adequately describe. "Sarge! Sarge!" Lieutenant Flaherty started yelling. "Jesus Christ, Sarge!" One of our warriors panicked and squeezed off a round. Down the line, another frightened Marine fired a shot. So much for our fire discipline. By now I was out of my hole, and so were the other junior NCOs. We were crawling left and right, from one hole to the next, hissing orders at the scared warriors. "Calm down! Play it cool! Hold your damn fire!" Gradually, up and down the perimeter, the rifle fire ceased, the yelling stopped, and the situation returned to normal. Nearly normal. From where I was positioned, I could hear Sergeant Kulchicki, now wide awake, muttering a string of wonderfully colourful curses and four-letter words. The air around him would have turned blue if it wasn't already so black. It wasn't until the following morning that the rest of us found out what had happened. An inquisitive lizard, never before hearing so strange a noise on Guadalcanal, stopped by for a look-see at the sleeping sergeant. The lizard had the misfortune of getting too close. Like a Hoover vacuum cleaner with a faulty motor, Kulchicki had inhaled several inches of hapless lizard into his mouth and clamped his teeth together, hard. Thus the choking, coughing, spitting and swearing. We had no idea how many Japanese were on the island, or how well armed they were. We were bivouacked little more than a few thousand yards away from the airfield they'd been constructing. They could be lurking in the deep shadows just outside our perimeter, preparing a banzai attack. All we knew for certain was that they were here with us on this strange jungle island, and they wanted to kill us if they could. Adding to our ignorance about anything that might be happening around us was our total lack of radio communication. We had to rely on our eyes and ears, and on runners to communicate from one unit to another. It was the middle of the 20th century, but communication at company level and below was on a par with the armies of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Just before dark, one of our neighbouring platoons got orders to establish a security outpost, about 20 or 25 yards to the front of the perimeter. The detail went to Sergeant William Steen, who selected 4 men to go with him. Before they moved out, he told the rest of his platoon that he'd be back to the perimeter as soon as he got his men dug in. He led his men out, and they vanished almost immediately into the dense, tall Karnai grass that grew everywhere around us. After establishing the forward outpost, Steen headed back toward the perimeter alone. By now, darkness was total, and what little visibility the night sky might have given us was nullified by the Karnai grass. Several men in Steen's platoon heard the sound of somebody thrashing through the grass, coming in their direction. Their nerves were on edge. Nobody had a clue as to where the Japanese were, or whether they'd located our position. A voice came to the platoon through the darkness, low but clear. "Okay, men, it's me." A shot rang out as Sergeant Steen spoke. One of his men, frightened and trigger-happy, had squeezed off a round from his rifle. It hit Steen in the chest. Within seconds, the men got him back behind the line, but it was no good. He was bleeding profusely, and within 3 minutes he was dead. Later that night, the man who had shot Steen cracked up. Corpsman took the man away, and nobody in our unit ever heard from him or about him again. The company had taken 2 casualties, and we had yet to encounter our first Jap. Steen's premonition that he wasn't going to survive the Guadalcanal campaign turned out to be tragically accurate, but his good buddy Chink McCallan had that letter to Steen's wife in his field pack. We were on the canal for 3 days before my family and friends read about it in the hometown newspaper. My parents wouldn't have known that I was there, only that the Americans had landed. Even then, the news services got the story wrong, attributing the American invasion of the Solomons to the army. Or maybe it was MacArthur himself sending out what today is called misinformation. Anyway, the Marines had made the landing, but we weren't mentioned in this August 10th story. At this point, Guadalcanal and Tulagi weren't yet specified as the islands in the Solomons where we'd made the assault. We were there, all right, but to tell the truth, it often felt more like the Japanese were assaulting us. August 8th, D-Day +1, at about 0800, our company moved out from the position we'd established on our first night. We headed for the airfield, which we knew was located just beyond the Ilu River. We progressed across the island's tropical grassy plain, with the 2nd platoon acting as point, and with flank guards moving along both sides of the main body of Marines. We still hadn't encountered any enemy. After about 45 minutes, word was passed back from point that the airfield was in sight. Now our platoon took its turn at point, and the 2nd platoon fell back with the main body of troops. The flank guards changed too, coming from the 3rd platoon. Changing point and flanks at regular intervals was standard procedure. My squad took point for our platoon, and there, straight ahead of us, was the Japanese airfield's runway. My 2-point men were Hap Pelosian and either Stanley Zager or Curly Woods, all three of them good men, and to my knowledge, we were the first Americans to set foot on what would soon be called Henderson Field. We occupied the airfield without incident, and with no sign that Japanese troops were in the area. My squad was on the runway, which was good news, but we also were wide open, and that was bad news. The rest of L Company's 1st platoon came in behind us. I positioned myself directly behind my 2 points, but I kept the squad well spread out because of our potentially vulnerable position. Suddenly somebody hollered, "Cover! Cover!" The next thing I heard came from the sky, the drone of approaching aircraft. Cover, hell! Where do you find cover on a goddamned wide-open airstrip? All we could do was hit the deck and hug the ground. At best, I caught maybe a glimpse of Japanese float planes at about the same moment they cut their engines and came gliding toward us. I say maybe a glimpse because they were coming at us with the morning sun directly behind them. Bullets started pinging around us, and the only thing we could do was answer blindly with small arms fire while we hugged the dirt. Then the aircraft engines roared back to life and the planes were gone. We picked ourselves up, shaken by the ordeal, but nobody had been hit. No casualties. It was our first experience with enemy fire, and this time we were lucky. That incident was our first encounter with a standard Japanese trick, and we knew we'd have to learn how to deal with it, and learn fast. This was no time to cry for mama, and no time for pissing and moaning from the ranks. We were there to fight a war for the US of A, and if we were going to survive, we'd have to learn how to cope. It was August 29th before the folks back home read that we had captured a Japanese airfield. I don't know who the eyewitness was in the Buffalo Evening News story below, but the Japanese we killed on the canal weren't in any caverns. The quantity of captured supplies noted was also overrated, but the story's main point was correct. We had taken the airfield, and it was ours for keeps. With the Marines now established on the airfield, L Company moved on, crossing the Lunga River and heading for a beach position beyond the river's west bank. General Vandergrift's command post was about to be located in the area adjacent to the airfield, but we had a different assignment. If nothing else, the visit by Japanese aircraft had made it clear that they wanted their airfield back. It was our job to make sure they didn't get it. From the river's west bank, L Company swung around and headed back in the direction of the beach. We were about to enter Cucum, a small village of native huts situated just above the beach, and not much more than 100 yards or so west of where the Lunga River empties into the sea. In short order, our scouts held up our parade, passing word back to us that they were on the outskirts of Cucum. They'd heard what sounded like a running motor, and they wanted some of us to go up with them and verify the source of the noise. I took my squad up ahead, and we found that the noise came from behind a 6-foot-high box-like structure. From where we stood, it looked like a refrigerator or a freezer. Clearly it had been left behind by the Japanese, which meant it might be booby-trapped. Following standard safety procedure, we requested a length of rope, and word was passed back to the platoon. When the rope reached us, the scouts took it to the box and tied one end to a kind of door handle. They backed off slowly with the rope and then pulled from a safe distance. No explosion and no problem of any kind. In fact, the news was good. The door swung open, and lo and behold, we were gazing at a cooler full of ice-cold Asahi beer, imperial-size quarts. But now we were getting word to move forward. Sergeant Wild Bill Kolchicki appeared. "What's the hold-up?" he asked. Then he saw the beer. I've already mentioned that old Bill was a connoisseur of beer. Quicker than I can describe it, he took a sample from the cooler, cracked open the bottle, and took a long pull. He lowered his bottle and let out a sigh of pleasure. "Each man take 1 bottle and move out," he said. We followed the sergeant's orders. I followed his orders twice. Cucum consisted of little more than a few huts and 2 larger wooden shacks, apparently built by the Japanese. One was a crude warehouse, and the other was used as a mess hall. Inside the mess hall we saw a long table with rice bowls, the rice still uneaten. The US Navy's early morning shelling the day before must have scared the Japanese away from their breakfast. We didn't stay for more than a quick look. We kept moving out of Cucum, down to the beach, then west along the shore for not much more than another 100 yards. There we established our position for the rest of that day and the following morning. So there we were, sitting under coconut trees on the berm line and looking out to sea. The day was hot, nearly 100 degrees, so we did what came naturally, which was to drink our ice-cold beer. Situated in our area was a gun emplacement with a 5-inch gun and plenty of ammo inside its parapet. 2 of our guys had been seagoing, becoming familiar with artillery, and now they were looking this gun over. They concluded that it was American-made and guessed it had probably been captured by the Japanese when they'd taken Wake Island, then shipped here for shore defense. Several others from my squad joined the original 2 guys examining the gun, and pretty soon they were operating the mechanism that raised it up and down. Next, they began moving it laterally. A guy named Jerry told us that at one time he'd served aboard ship and had been on a 5-inch gun crew. By this time, one of the riflemen in my squad, Yogi Milana, was tracking, and Larry Gherkin, my barman, was being shown how to set time on the ammo. Everybody was drinking his beer and feeling happy. No officers were around. Suddenly, from out of nowhere, a Japanese submarine broke through the water's surface close to shore. There was no mistaking it, and its gun crew was rushing out on deck. They swung their deck gun, aiming it toward us as though they owned the damn place and knew we were drinking up their beer. Jerry, our original artillery expert, assembled his makeshift crew and got them tracking the gun. The sub was moving very slowly on the water and was easy to track. Larry Gherkin had just loaded a point-detonating armor-piercing round. From my vantage point at the base of a coconut palm tree, I clearly saw that the Japanese gun crew was in action too. By now they had their gun pointed at us. If we'd been on the canal longer and had time to develop some battle sense, we could have forgotten about that 5-inch gun and picked off the Japanese sailors with our Springfield L-3-5, as the sub was only a few hundred yards offshore. "They'd better hit that guy with their first round," I remarked to our platoon sergeant as we watched our guys preparing to fire. Meanwhile, they continued tracking the sub. Jerry was on elevation. He kept calling out the range and other information. Suddenly he called out, "Stand by to fire!" Then, "Fire!" Boom! The gun went off, and we watched. They missed the sub by 200 or 300 yards long and 100 yards wide. The Japanese had been waiting for that. The moment after our gun went off, the Japanese crew fired 2 quick rounds, then hurried off deck as the sub started submerging. We each took cover as best we could. Both Japanese rounds hit our beach, exploding near us, but miraculously not hurting any of us. Were we frightened? Hell, yes. But we calmed down again after about 5 minutes. About then, a jeep came bouncing down to the beach and braked to a stop. In it was the regimental commander, Colonel Leroy Hunt. And was he pissed off? He wanted to know what the hell we were firing that gun at. Where the hell were our CO and platoon leader? Who the hell knew? He yelled for a while, threatening to put us all in jail, but under those conditions that was part of his job. Nobody was about to go to jail or get court-martialed or anything else. The beer bottles had been stashed out of sight, the gun crew wasn't anywhere near the parapet, and the sub was gone. A very important problem never addressed during the entire Guadalcanal campaign was the fact that Marine units had no real system of communication with other units. With rare exceptions, we had no radios or anything else to pass on information regarding what we did or did not see. To let the company command post know that a sub had just surfaced, we'd have had to send a runner, and that would take time. If the company commander or a flanking platoon had any input, advice, or remarks to offer, a runner would have to relay that information too. That would take more time. It was our training and our experience that took over whenever a firefight or any other unexpected situation developed. Backtracking a little, Yogi Milana, who was part of the gun crew that day, recalls the submarine incident a little differently. Several of us were examining the abandoned Japanese anti-aircraft guns situated in our area of the beach. The sights were smashed, but we could still move and point the gun, and there was a lot of ammunition. That's when the Japanese submarine appeared offshore. It was much farther out than Ore's estimate. I used to do a lot of ocean fishing, and I came to understand that anyone looking at a ship or any other object across a body of water and having no other references generally comes up with a poor estimate of the ship's distance. I figured that the sub was maybe a mile offshore, which was beyond the range of our rifles. The gun crew on the sub started firing toward us, and we fired back. Some of our shells were designed to explode on direct contact. Others had timing mechanisms. 5 of us manned the gun, including Jerry, Larry Gherkin, a guy named Motzinger, and me. Jerry loaded the gun with a timed shell, closed the breech, and we fired. The shell exploded way past the sub, as Ore said. What he didn't say is that we fired several more shells, cutting back on the timing mechanism with each shot. Finally, when we'd gotten one down to about 8 seconds, the shot burst right above the sub. I'll swear we saw some of the Japanese gun crew blown off the deck. We lowered the elevation slightly, but before we could fire another shell, the sub disappeared below the surface. We weren't credited for the encounter, which went to the 11th Marines. About 20 minutes after the submarine disappeared, 15 or 20 Japanese 2-engine bombers came over and dumped their load of bombs on the guys who had stolen their cold beer, us. That was the beginning of 4 months of daily bombing, shelling, and anything else the Japanese could throw at us. We didn't take any casualties from that bombing, but it did leave us shook up, with our nerves on edge and maybe a little jerky. Anyway, no one was wounded. The really bad news came that night, though it took a while before we found out about it and learned how serious it was. Far out at sea, we heard the fireworks and saw flashes as naval artillery shells lit up the night sky. We didn't know it, but from our beach we were witnessing the Battle of Savo Island, in which the US Navy took a beating. It might have been the next day that our own Navy's brass met on a ship and received word of an additional approaching Japanese task force. They weren't about to take any chances with our own ships. Once again, the US Navy was making plans to abandon us. It was on D-Day +2 that one or more Japanese, observing us from a distant inland high point, decided to take a few shots at us. The rifle fire came from somewhere up on a ridge. The 1st Platoon, L Company, was moving west along the shore toward what would become our permanent position on the MLR. We were nearing our destination when those rounds of rifle fire came winging into our area. We all hit the deck and lay flat for a few minutes, waiting, expecting more rifle fire. There wasn't any more, but we took our time getting up. One thing you never want to do is present yourself as a potential target to an enemy rifleman, especially when you can't see him. Lieutenant Flash Flaherty happened to be on the ground near me, and I don't recall whether it was his idea or mine, but we decided that this was a good time to try out one of our new rifle grenades. We were first introduced to the rifle grenades in Wellington, New Zealand, just before we shipped out for combat. We'd been told that this model was a Belgian invention. A gunnery sergeant held a brief class session and showed us how to use them, but they were nearly as new to him as they were to us. Now, lying in the dirt, Flash Flaherty and I were doing our best to recall how to fire one of those grenades at the suspected enemy position. Between us, we recalled that what we had to do was attach a special wire piece on an 03 rifle by extending the wire from the rifle's rear sight to its front sight. Next, we'd have to put what the instructor sergeant had called a trombone attachment on the end of the rifle barrel. The rifle grenade itself was a fat thing that fit into the attachment. Flaherty pointed at the ridge. "The Japanese fired at us from there," he said. I agreed. If the Japanese was alone or with just a few men, they would have sized up the strength of our unit and by now would be moving away from us fast. But just in case anyone was dumb enough to remain up on that ridge, we decided now to take a shot at him. "You ever shoot one of these grenades before?" Flash asked me. "Hull no," I said. "We can try it, though." Every squad had one man who carried the equipment to fire this new Belgian rifle grenade. We located the guy in my squad, rigged up his rifle, and put the trombone launcher attachment on the barrel. This was going to be an experiment, a learning experience. We did remember being told that we couldn't launch a grenade with a normal bullet. The live bullet would go right through the launcher and wreck it. We had to put a blank cartridge into the rifle's firing chamber. Somebody elected me to shoot the thing, or maybe I elected myself. So there I was, peeking up from the ground, sighting my target. I pointed to a large boulder up on the ridge, some 75 yards distant and above us. "That'll be my aiming point," I said. "Okay," Flash said. "Go ahead." I jammed the rifle stock tight against my shoulder, raised myself up off the ground to a kneeling position, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle went bang, and the recoil jarred it loose from my grip. The rifle smacked me hard in the jaw. With that, I went down on my face while the little bluebirds started going tweet, tweet, tweet around my head. I might have been out for about 10 seconds before I shook myself back to consciousness. "Did I hit it?" I asked. "Did I hit it?" Yeah, Flash said, not sounding enthusiastic. "But it didn't blow. The damn thing didn't explode." "What do you mean? I fired the damn thing." "I don't know," he said. "All I know is it didn't explode." "But I hit it, didn't I? I hit the target? It came down on the target?" "Yeah, you hit it," Flash said. "The damn thing just didn't work." We tried to figure out why the rifle grenade hadn't exploded, and finally decided that maybe it was a dud. We didn't have time to do much speculating, because by now it was clear that the enemy had vanished, and we still had to dig in at the spot that would become our permanent position. A day or two later, we ran into a guy from another unit who really understood how the new style grenade was supposed to work. We explained our misfortune to him, and he asked us, "Did you pull the firing pin out?" "Pin? What pin?" we said. "The pin. The damn pin. We should have figured out that a rifle grenade would have a safety pin to pull, the same as a hand grenade. I got smacked in the jaw for nothing. That, I have to admit, was deeply embarrassing, both to me and to Flash. We didn't talk about it much after that day. We never gave it much thought, nor were we ever too concerned about it. But the Japanese on Guadalcanal kept a much closer watch over our ground activities than we did over theirs. At least that was the case while we were contained within the small perimeter around Henderson Field between August and December 1942. In addition, the Japanese must have had some type of communication system that was at least as good as ours, and ours was one step above nothing. L Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, was dug in on a line that extended from the beach, across a coconut grove, and up an incline to its high point on a coral ridge that formed part of the south line of defence. Looking south from our ridge was looking toward the island's interior, a series of highlands surrounded by thick jungle. On the ridge, our line of defence turned left and connected with our neighbouring company, also from the 5th Marines. Shortly after our line of defence was established, those of us in rifle companies spent our days performing 5 basic tasks. First was going out on small group patrols. Second was working on our defence positions, making our foxholes, or spider holes, more comfortable and deeper. Third was scrounging for materials, including barbed wire and anything else to make our lives safer. Fourth was performing work details in the area to our rear. Fifth was cleaning our weapons and manning our defence line. Most of the time, the Japanese managed to sneak observers close enough to our line to keep track of what we were doing. They probably watched us on a regular basis, getting familiar with us to a point where they might have had nicknames for us, maybe Skoshe-san, which means little guy, or Taukse-sanoki, which means big guy. Many years have passed, and my Japanese is slipping, so readers are welcome to correct me here. On one occasion, we started digging a well in the centre of our coconut grove, because the water we were getting from our rear was being transported in cans previously used to hold oil or gasoline. That was a simple case of poor logistics, which left our water supply undrinkable. Digging a well in the sandy soil was a slow, tedious job, made slower by the fact that we had to do it between our normal official job routines. Well digging was not considered an official company project. One day, when we were about halfway through the job, the once or twice daily flight of Japanese bombers that normally came over to bomb either the airfield or Cucum dropped their bombs short. They left a line of bomb craters that strung right through our area. Lucky for us, we didn't take any casualties, and the bombs also missed our partially dug well. The incident meant nothing to me at the time, but thinking about it years later, I decided that our half-dug well had been their intended target. Probably a Japanese ground observer had told his commander that he was digging some kind of hole at specified grid coordinates, and it probably deserves a special plaster job from the bombers. On another occasion, much later, we went to work building what we thought would be a super-duper, one-of-a-kind air raid bunker. Several hours after we completed that project, the air raid siren sounded, and about 6 bombers came over. They dropped all of their bombs, plus a couple of empty screaming bottles, right into our area. The empty bottles were the Japanese version of psychological warfare. As they fell through the air, the bottles gave off a screaming whistle, which could sound pretty scary. One 500-pound bomb scored a direct hit and finished off our brand-new bunker. That hit told us that one of their observers had been watching us from a point where we couldn't see him. He probably didn't know what we were building, but just to be safe, he passed word up through command, and they decided to knock it out. Then there was that infamous lone Japanese field artillery piece that Marines all over the canal came to know and hate, Pistol Pete. Random incoming rounds from Pistol Pete were a harassment and not great for our morale, but they seldom caused serious damage. A half-dozen or so of us would be sitting in a group, clowning around, skylarking, trading stories, and suddenly a round from Pistol Pete would come in. You might hear it whistle over your head if it was long, or maybe it would be short. You never see the one that gets you. But in either case, it was no big deal. Except a few minutes later, a second round would come in, and we knew for sure that its deflection and range had been corrected. If the first round had come in long, the second would come in short, or vice versa. The first among us to notice the correction would holler, "It's a bracket!" We would dive into our holes like a bunch of ground squirrels, and we knew that in this case a Japanese observer was somewhere out in the jungle, watching us, observing the location of Pistol Pete's shell bursts, then signalling the information back to the gun crew. He had some mode of communication, maybe a telephone, maybe a radio, and was instructing the gun crew and helping them zero in on the target, which happened to be us. By itself, this might not sound like a big deal, but on the canal it was an advantage that the Japanese had and we didn't. When we moved forward on a platoon patrol or on a squad or small group patrol, we had no way of communicating with our main force to our rear. Headquarters' attitude was, "Good luck, see you when you get back." We were being watched, and most of us riflemen manning perimeter positions seldom gave the situation a minute's thought. Walking around on our main and only line of defence, knowing that we were probably being observed and not being particularly concerned about it, tells you what it takes to be a frontline fighter. The main ingredients that make a good warrior are youth, lack of fear, stupidity, and patriotism in roughly equal amounts. That was us. There we were, yours truly and thousands more Marines like me, stuck on a miserable jungle island, half-starved, abandoned by our own navy, and being shot at, bombed and shelled by the Japanese. How did we get here? How did it all start? What were the circumstances that sent each of us into the United States Marine Corps? My L Company cobbers and I were one hell of a long way from home, and sometimes our chances of ever seeing home again didn't look very good. Like every other fighting man who ever went into combat in any war, we thought a lot about home. Sometimes when I remember the sight of 30 scared Marines huddled in a Higgins boat, or 8 cobbers moving low through dense jungle, bucket helmets on their heads and Springfield L-3s ready, or just recall the look of a lone shirtless buddy sitting next to his spider hole looking skyward at Japanese bombers on their way to a target, I remind myself who was fighting this war. Kids were fighting this war. Kids. I was born in a very small Pennsylvania town called Austin, a few miles south of the New York state line and about halfway between Pittsburgh and Buffalo. Austin is so small that some Pennsylvania maps don't even show it. I first saw the light of day in July 1921, the 5th of 9 Marian children. Both my parents originally came from the Abruzzi region of Italy, high up in the Apennine Mountains, about 100 kilometers east of Rome. The family name Marian was originally Mariani. My mother was Annunziata, so named because she was born on the Feast of the Annunciation in March 1892. After she came to America, she called herself Nancy. She arrived in America soon after she and my father were married. My father, Perry Marion, was a good-looking guy who attracted the eye of many a young lady, but he had eyes only for his Nancy. Unlike many Italian immigrants of her generation, Mamma learned proper grammatical English from a teacher, and she disapproved of some Italians who came to America, enjoyed the good things America has to offer, but never took the trouble to learn proper English. She had her standards, and she held to them, but she was also a woman with a very warm heart. We Marines who went to Guadalcanal were children of the Great Depression. Mostly poor and hungry and a little underfed, we were street smart. I like to say either street smart or hill smart, depending on where someone came from. Yogi Milana was street smart, Brooklyn style, and had a couple years of college on top of it. Others, like Ernie Snowden and Speedy Spach, were country boys from Kentucky and North Carolina, and they demonstrated their own style of smarts. But in any case, we knew how to think on our feet and find our way in and out of a tight hole pretty damned fast. Some people say we were survivors. I was street smart, getting most of my education on South Park Avenue in Buffalo, New York, where my family moved when I was 7. Most of my friends didn't go to high school. This was a time before the squadrons of yellow school buses that now take kids from their front door to school every day. We kids couldn't afford the car fare and the things you needed to go to school. Some of us were fortunate enough to be able to walk to high school. We Marians were relatively fortunate. I completed 3 years of high school and my older brother Jim stuck it out and graduated, but most of my generation's kids in the neighborhood didn't make it. We were all working to help at home. I had 1 good shirt to my name, 1 decent pair of trousers, and 1 pair of shoes. We would stuff cardboard in our shoes to keep the water out when we wore through our soles. Our whole generation was that way. It didn't matter if you had a potato on the dinner table in South Buffalo or a bowl of potato soup out in Kansas. Some days you were hungry. We had smarts all right, but they were different smarts from the kind kids have today. Coming of age at the tail end of the 1930s, when jobs and money were still scarce and my career prospects as a civilian were less than encouraging, I joined the Marines. When we thought about joining the armed services, we didn't think about career training or talk over our opportunities with guidance counselors. No, it was more like 3 guys standing on the street corner and finally deciding, "This is shit, let's see if we can join the service." There was a lot of talk of war in the late 1930s, so the service was on everybody's mind. It was very hard to join the service in 1939-40. That would change dramatically in a year or so, but in 39 and 40 there were only about 17,000 men in the Marine Corps, and in the Buffalo district the quota for a month was 3 recruits. I was very fortunate, or maybe unfortunate. The food at boot camp was crappy compared with the food in the military today. They used to give you what you might call cheap meat, like spare ribs and liver. But to us kids from the cities along the East Coast or from the hills, it was a feast. I ate it with both hands. It beat the potato or small bowl of pasta I'd have for supper at home by 1 hell of a long shot. This was food. Besides, you got your original issue of clothes, although you paid for anything you lost or needed after that out of your salary. I weighed about 128 pounds when I joined the Marines. I got paid $20.80 a month, plus a place to sleep and all I could eat 3 times a day. Not bad. They'd take a few dimes out of your pay for the old sailors' home, and you'd still have enough to buy some tobacco and paper and roll your own cigarettes. We were so accustomed to doing what we were told, or at least pretending to do what we were told, that the harshness of Marine Corps boot camp was not much of a shock to any of us. NCOs barked orders at us, and as crazy as they might have sounded, we carried them out. In that era, when your father told you to do something, you didn't question it. You did it. And he wasn't about to negotiate with you over following directions. If the priest over at Holy Family Church told you to do it, if the cop from the precinct told you to do it, you just did it. So a Marine NCO was no shock to our sensibilities. A little later on, if we complained among ourselves, We complained because we knew there was a war in our future. We knew we'd be fighting the Japanese, and we knew the Corps didn't have the tools we needed to carry on a war. Before Pearl Harbor, the appropriations for the military were sadly inadequate. Even after Pearl, we went into combat with ammunition, hand grenades, and small arms of World War I vintage. Our rifles were 03s, and that 03 stands for the year the military first purchased them from the Springfield Arms Factory, 1903. But at the same time, the Army was getting new rifles, M1 Garans, while we still were firing World War I Springfields. The Corps preached at us every day that it was inevitable that our country was going to war with Japan, not Germany. It was always the Japanese. We would be sent to fight the Japanese, and everything we were learning, everything we were enduring, was to help ensure that we would come back alive from that war. Too many of us didn't. But for all of us who did, and for all of us who lived to see a new life, with television, international travel, flights into space, and the dawn of the 21st century, we owe some of it to the attitudes passed on to us from the Marines of the old breed. In 1940, there was very little grumbling. There was even an offence called silent contempt, which meant you gave your superior a dirty look and your expression told him you thought he was a jackass. Silent contempt was worth 3 days in the brig with piss and punk. There were a lot of quiet F hymns, but they were very quiet. After boot camp, when I was first assigned to Indian Head, Maryland, near D.C., I didn't get liberty for more than 2 weeks. Finally, when I got up enough nerve to ask for 12 hours so I could go over and see Washington, I was told that my services could not be spared. Or Marion was so damned important to the well-being of the United States Marine Corps that he couldn't get a few hours' liberty to see the nation's capital. Yes, we were kids, no smarter or stronger, no wiser or more worldly than the generations of kids who preceded us, or those who have followed us to this day. But we were kids with exactly the set of character traits needed in 1941. I joined the Corps on April 25, 1940, and was sent directly to Parris Island. Boot camp at Parris Island, South Carolina, was tough in those days, but it was no trouble for me, or for most of the guys who came into the Corps with me. The only time I had a problem was when we went to the rifle range. Our coach turned out to be a big-mouth rebel boot corporal who sized me up and asked, "Where you from, boy?" "Buffalo, sir." "That's in New York, ain't it?" "Yes, sir." "And you a Dago, ain't Chew?" "Sir, I'm Italian descent." "A Italian from New York. That's the worst mix for a Maureen." He went on and on like that, and I had no choice but to listen to it. He saw to it that my time on the rifle range became 2 weeks of hell, but much to that idiot corporal's surprise, I qualified. I never saw him again after boot camp. During my 20 years in the Corps, I stayed on the lookout for that fool, but he saved me the trouble of knocking him on his arse, either by getting himself killed in the war or by leaving the Corps. Much later, when it became my turn to exert some leadership, I thought of him as the first among a handful of NCOs and officers who taught me how not to teach or treat my men. His kind was a minority in the Corps, but it takes only one to make a Marine's life miserable. After boot camp, my first duty station was at the Naval Powder Factory at Indian Head, Maryland, about 20 miles south of D.C. At that time, that was its official name, the Naval Powder Factory. Its official name is now Indian Head Division, Naval Surface Warfare Center. There were about 25 men at that post, and the single purpose of our being there was guard duty, day after day after day, and night. Our typical watches would be 4 hours on and 4 hours off, followed by 4 more hours on and 8 hours off. That, in turn, would be followed by 4 more on and 16 hours off. That completed the cycle, which would be repeated over and over again without a break. In other words, no time for liberty. Hours off duty gave us just enough time to wash our clothes, press uniforms, shine our shoes and leather belt, and quietly repeat to ourselves, "I love the Corps." Try to fall asleep and they would make us fall out for close order drill, or dive bomb and police the area outside, picking up cigarette butts and trash. I kept myself, my clothes and my gear squared away and looking good, and in short order I was standing watch at the post's main gate. After 3 months, I decided it was time for a change in routine. I asked for and got a transfer to Dahlgren, Virginia, across the Potomac. You had to be on the ball to get assigned to Dahlgren. The Marine detachment there consisted of only 18 men and a platoon sergeant who was officer in charge. Dahlgren was where the Navy tested all of its big ships' guns. At that time, they were also assembling and adjusting the top-secret Norden bombsight, which became an important fixture on U.S. bombers during World War II. After 3 months' duty at Dahlgren, a certain young lady of my acquaintance from off-post threatened to get me into the kind of trouble I didn't need. I told the sergeant about it, and he suggested that my safest course was to get myself transferred out of Dahlgren. One phone call to D.C. was all that was needed. 2 days later, I was on my way to the Fleet Marines in Guantanamo, Cuba. That's where I joined L Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment. I didn't know it then, but that put me on the road to Guadalcanal. I joined L Company at the beginning of December 1940, just a little over a year before Pearl Harbor. At that time, L Company's strength was only about 35 men, with a cadre of maybe 2 or 3 officers and 1 corpsman. We were the raggedy-ass Marines, dressed up with campaign hats, field clothes that were part Marine Corps and part Navy, leggings, high-top dress shoes, and Model 3.30 caliber Springfield rifles. Most of the sergeants in the Fleet Marine 5th were old-timers. When military historians refer to the Marines' old breed, these are the men they are talking about. A few of them who had fought in France during World War I were still active. All of them had fought in places like Haiti, which they pronounced Haiti, Nicaragua and San Domingo, today the Dominican Republic, and some had even exchanged potshots with the Japanese in China. It was these men, the famous old breed, who trained us at Guantanamo. It was from them that we learned many good maneuvers, tactics and tricks, battle savvy, that would save many of our lives during the following years, when we were pitted against the Japanese in the Pacific. Pretty soon, we were teaching the same tricks to new recruits who were coming into the Marines with the growing threat of war. They were the kids we had to train and then lead into combat. By the end of December 1940, Marine Reserve units were being called to active duty. For L Company, that meant raising our strength from 35 to 50 men. The Corps repeatedly tried to get us better and newer equipment, but those efforts produced few results. The Navy's battleship admirals and their other top brass fought the Corps tooth and nail for every piece of equipment they were forced to give us. As they saw it, they could win any war at any time they pleased with the big guns on their battleships and cruisers. The events of World War II demonstrated time after time that they seldom hit anything with those guns. Anybody who thinks I'm overstating the case should keep in mind that the Navy never won a major World War II sea battle with surface vessels until the very end, by which time the Japanese had no sea power or air power left. The big sea battles that our Navy won, starting with the Coral Sea and Midway, have to be credited to our Navy and Marine pilots, and to the planes they flew from the decks of our carriers. Our training at Guantanamo gave all of us the opportunity to familiarize ourselves with every weapon our unit carried, weapons that we used later on the canal. They included the .03 Springfield rifle, the BAR, Browning automatic rifle, VB rifle grenades, and water-cooled .30 caliber machine guns. We didn't fire them, mind you. Firing weapons cost money, and in 1940 the Navy Department wasn't about to let us expend their resources. That .30 caliber ball ammunition cost 3 cents a round in those days. We'd been taught that we were professionals whose primary function was to eliminate all enemies of the United States in the most expeditious manner and at the lowest cost to the taxpayer. While we were in Cuba, my gunnery sergeant and an old veteran of Haiti made scouts out of me and one of my best buddies, Harry Denham, who was better known in the platoon as Stinky. Stinky Denham and I had a special talent for driving the gunny nuts, but we also learned a lot from him. It was combat knowledge that became valuable to us later when we went to war. Before the United States entered World War II, we Marines had no choice other than to take part in the political games our leaders were playing. France was under Nazi occupation, and by mid-1941 the Vichy French had several small warships anchored at Martinique and in Dakar, Africa. Apparently, somebody in Washington saw those ships as a threat to the USA. We, that is the 5th Marines, were sent down to Martinique twice, on old battleships that were held together with not a hell of a lot more than paper clips and chewing gum. Our ships would approach the harbour and signal to the Vichy French, "Come out and fight." They'd signal back, "Up yours!" or the French equivalent. Aboard ship, we ran practice drills, the intention, at least in theory, being that we would use whaleboats and an odd assortment of motor launches to land on the Martinique dock. We were carrying our .03 Springfield rifles and attired in campaign hats, leggings, khaki shirts and trousers, and dress high-top shoes, polished no less, and were augmented and guided by several bluejackets. The idea seemed to be that at the sight of us, the French would panic and run like hell. We went to Dakar once with the same drill, and they weren't impressed either. Following those futile gestures, we were sent ashore on Liberty, where the French champagne and women were, one cheaper than the other, and then we sailed back to Norfolk. From there we returned to our base at New River. At that time, the 6th Marine Regiment, previously based in San Diego, was transported through the Panama Canal, then up the coast to Norfolk, where it took over our supply and ammo ships, and sailed north to occupy Iceland. 4 or 5 months before Pearl Harbor, the 5th Marine Regiment intensified rifle company training to the point where each company would leave our tent camp at 0730 on Monday mornings, go out into the boondocks, train, and not return until mid-morning on Fridays. During that period, we graduated from tent camp to fibre huts. The Friday routine didn't vary. 1. Clean weapons and gear. 2. Shave and shower. 3. Undergo inspection of all weapons, including crew-served ones. 4. Go to chow. And then, 5. Go on liberty, usually at about 1300 hours, and be free through the rest of the weekend. During that period just before the war, the 5th Marine Regiment was commanded by Colonel Bobby Blake, a World War I veteran. Colonel Blake was 50 or so, tall and handsome, clean-cut, a father of a man. I don't know many details about his career, but I do know that he'd been stationed at posts and on ships around the world, had been in France during World War I, and had later participated in the so-called Banana Wars that erupted throughout the Caribbean and Central America. At the time, he commanded the 5th Marines. A rifle company consisted of 50 to 60 enlisted men, including NCOs, and maybe 4 officers. Combined into the 5th Marine Regiment, these companies played what I believe was the most important role in Marine Corps history. When the war broke out, the 1st and the 7th Regiments were reactivated with men from the 5th Regiment, augmented with new recruits. When the 1st Raider Battalion was formed in 1941 at Quantico, it consisted of the 5th Marines 1st Battalion, later augmented with raw recruits who'd had only 3 weeks of training at Paris Island. When the 1st Parachute Battalion was formed in 1941, many of the men came from the 5th Marines. The same was true of the Tank Battalion's 1st Scouts. Most officers in the 1st Raider and 1st Parachute Battalions came from the 5th Marines. By now, we were getting replacements at New River, and we were training day and night to get our new warriors ready for combat. We knew we were going to war, because we were told as much at least 10 times a day. What's more, we knew we were going to war against Japan, because the old China hands in our outfit were telling us as much, and were teaching us everything they knew about the Japanese. But unless we were actually out in the field on training exercises, we never talked about our training, and we never talked about war. We just didn't give a damn, because we knew we'd have to do more than talk about it later, when the war actually came. The men I associated with in L Company, including Willie Shoemaker, Pete Rogers, Stinky Denham, George Odell, Larry Hardrock Gherkin, Chink McCallan, Hank Klemicki, Joe Barnes, Ben Selvitel, Speedy Spash, and Art Boston, talked about everything and anything but war. We didn't worry about it, and we didn't give a damn about it. We knew it was coming. We knew we were good. And there was no reason for us to brag about how we were going to fight the war when it came. We just didn't talk about it. On Friday, December 5th, 1941, Liberty Call sounded first for the NCOs. The rest of us fell out in the company street and the first sergeant instructed the senior PFC to march the men to the parade ground, where he was to report to a certain captain. As my own L Company approached the parade ground, I saw Colonel Blake sitting in a jeep. I saw other companies approaching from different directions, arriving at the parade ground from their own company areas. When we were all present, about 150 of us, privates and PFCs, all kids, the captain in charge had us approach the colonel's jeep and stand at ease. Colonel Blake stood up in his jeep and motioned for us to come right up around him. He didn't have a microphone, so he raised his voice a little, but he didn't have to shout. He started talking to us, gravel crunchers. Many years have passed since that afternoon, but I still vividly recall the scene. Men, you have been training hard these past several months, and I'm happy and proud of your progress. When I've finished speaking, I want you to go on liberty, relax, and have a good time. Because when you return, you must become even more serious. You must prepare to become the future leaders and teachers in the Corps. In a few days, this country will be at war, and within a very short time, the Corps will more than triple in size. The training and direction of those new recruits will be your responsibility. You are the future staff NCOs of the Corps. The present staff NCOs will soon be the senior staff NCOs, and a large number among them will become commissioned officers. We, gravel crunchers, looked at each other with amazement, and we probably all were thinking the same thing. Me, a staff NCO in the Corps? The old man must have been out in the North Carolina sun too long. Colonel Blake continued, "What the Corps does and how well it succeeds in the coming war depends on you. We will give orders, but it will be each one of you men who trains, moves, and directs your platoon. You are the men who will see that our orders are executed. The honor of the Corps and the honor of our country will depend on you." He was looking at each one of us. "Enjoy your liberty now, but when you return on Monday, be prepared for increased responsibility. Be prepared to teach as you've been taught. The Corps is depending on you. Good luck. I have all the confidence in the world in you. Dismissed." That was it. Either the old man was suffering from sunstroke or he knew something, maybe simply intuited something based on his long experience in the Corps. 2 days later, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and within a very few weeks, we in the 5th Marine Regiment were training raw recruits, turning them into fine Marines. Those kids, only a little younger than we were, looked to us for advice. We had to set the standards and lead them by example. So we trained our new warriors, went with them to New Zealand, and from there to Guadalcanal. And from Guadalcanal, those one-time recruits went on to become NCOs, who led squads and sections to other battlefields, on Bougainville, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and several other ferociously contested Pacific islands on our road to Tokyo Bay.